Hello. This talk about Thomas Jennings Williams arose from the Shepherdswell and Coldred History Society's project to research the lives of Shepherdswell residents who served in the Great War. Thomas Williams was 48 when he joined the Army Service Corps in 1915, and he served almost 2.5 years in northern France. Thomas Williams was also a major personality in the Shepherdswell community. For almost 22 years, between 1904 and 1926, he was the licensee of the Bricklayers Arms. After relinquishing the license, he continued to live in the village for another 12 or so years, and as his health deteriorated, he moved to spend the final period of his life with one of his sons in Redhill, Surrey. The reports of his death in January 1941 in local newspapers all commented on his popularity in Shepherdswell. The Surrey Mirror described him as a very well-known former resident of Shepherdswell. The Dover Express talked of his many friends in the village. He was, amongst other things, a valued supporter of the cricket team. These small obituaries, however, can only give a glimpse of a life that was full of incident, a life of hardship, but also one of considerable adventure. Thomas Williams' life is part of the history of Shepherdswell. His life is also part of the history of mining communities, of the military, and also of the pubs in the Dover district. There is much about Thomas Williams that we do not know, and perhaps somebody listening to this talk can help us fill in some of the gaps. But we can piece together quite a lot because of the research carried out for the History Society's Great War project. And we must give particular thanks for this work to Carol Howell. We do not have a photo of Thomas Williams, but we do have a description of him from his enrolment papers when he signed up for the Royal Artillery at Dover Castle in 1900, when he was aged 32. The papers describe him as having a fair complexion, grey eyes and light brown hair. His left eye was slightly defective, and there were 2 women tattooed on his right forearm, with another woman and a star on the left. This was the 3rd time Thomas had signed up to the army, and as we will see, it would not be his last. The obituaries in the newspapers described Thomas as originally a native of Lancashire, and this was a description that Thomas Williams used to describe himself, with some pride it seems. A birthplace in Lancashire appears on many official documents, including, as this slide shows, information given to the census. But while Thomas Williams described himself as a native of Lancashire and kept his Lancashire accent, he was in fact born not in Lancashire, but in the village of Crowan in Cornwall. He was the 5th of 8 children. Crowan was in 1860s a teeming mining community surrounded by 6 mines producing copper and tin. It was home to several thousand miners and their families. Thomas' father, also called Thomas, was a miner. But in the 1860s, the crisis engulfing Cornish mining was gathering pace. And in the last decades of the century, the collapse in the price of metals and downturn in world trade in minerals led to a sudden collapse. All this had a devastating impact on the life of Cornish miners, An article in the local paper wrote, "The district is feeling the pinching times acutely, as anyone can see by passing through the villages. The broken windows and half-fed children tell their own tale. Once the homes of hundreds of industrious miners are now in a great measure forsaken. In Crowan, all the miners are idle." The crisis led to thousands of families to leave Cornwall, and large numbers emigrated to America. The Williams family moved when Thomas was 5 years old, and they relocated to Radcliffe, a small town now swallowed up by the sprawling conurbation of Manchester. Radcliffe was a village surrounded by coal mines and textile mills. Thomas's father went to work in the pits, but only 5 years after moving to Lancashire he died at the young age of 40. Thomas's mother, Martha, now had a major struggle to raise the family alone. All the children went to work as soon as they left school. The girls worked in the textile mills as pin winders. Thomas, at the age of 14, was working as a labourer in a brickworks, but soon afterwards he began working in a colliery, possibly Radcliffe Colliery, which you can see on the slide. In January 1886, a few months after his 18th birthday, Thomas enlisted into the army. He joined the 1st Battalion of the Manchester Regiment, and he moved into the barracks at Ashton-under-Lyne. The barracks had been built close to the textile towns in order to have troops available to intervene against agitation by working class activists for social and political reforms. Joining the army was probably an attempt by Thomas to escape a life in the pits. But life as a soldier did not go well. After only 5 weeks, Thomas absconded from the barracks. We can imagine the young Thomas rebelling against the drilling and discipline of army life. On the 17th of March 1886, a military court of inquiry found Thomas illegally absent from his duties, and missing also were items of clothing, equipment and regimental necessities. These included his uniform, a cap, clothing, braces, washing and grooming equipment, including brushes and combs, and also a fair amount of shoe polish. Thomas's next movements do not appear in the historical documents, so we have to use a little historical imagination. In Lancashire, a young man without skills and education, but with a background in the mines, would have had little alternative but to go to work in one of the pits. The next time, however, we find a trace of Thomas in the records is 10 years later, 1896, and he is now living in Dover. We meet him here in the old Endeavour on London Road in Dover. In 1895 and 1896, this pub was run by William Ward, originally a Londoner. Working behind the bar is his young daughter Annie, and Thomas frequents the pub and meets Annie, and on the 2nd of September 1896, Thomas, now aged 29, and the 22-year-old Annie were married in a service in Buckland. And we have to speculate what brought Thomas to Dover. But in the early 1890s, news about the birth of a mining industry in Kent spread through through mining communities. In 1890, coal and iron ore were discovered at Shakespeare Cove, the site of exploratory work for the Channel Tunnel. In 1896, the Shakespeare Colliery was opened, with 2 shafts sunk into what became known as the Brady Pit. Many young miners made their way to Kent in the hope of getting in on the ground floor of the burgeoning mining industry. Was Thomas one of these? We cannot be sure, but I think it's pretty likely. Almost immediately after his marriage to Annie, Thomas enlisted for 3 years in the Royal Artillery, based at Dover Castle. But his company was posted abroad to support the Hong Kong Singapore Battalion. This was a battalion made up primarily of troops recruited from India, particularly from Madras, and its main role was to defend the British colonies in Southeast Asia. That was mainly Hong Kong and what was known as the Straits Settlements, a group of settlements including Singapore, Penang and Malacca, most of the territories of which are now form part of Malaysia. Annie was allowed to accompany Thomas on the voyage to Southeast Asia, and she gave birth to the first of the couple's 4 children, a girl called Edith, while she was living in married quarters, probably in the Singapore Straits settlements. The couple would have 3 more children back in Kent, 2 sons and a daughter. Thomas completed 3 years' service, but in April 1900 at Dover again he re-enlisted for a further year, and this time he joined the Royal Garrison Artillery. The Royal Garrison Artillery was a new unit of the army, a product of reorganisation, and it served as the technical branch of the Royal Artillery. Its role was mainly to man and service the guns in the Empire's forts, including British coastal defences. Thomas was posted to the Golden Hill Fort on the Isle of Wight, a fort built in 1869 as a defence against possible French invasion, and which became known as one of Palmerston's follies. This time, Annie did not join her husband. As well as looking after her daughter, she worked in her father's new pub, the St Crispin, at Worth, quite near Sandwich. And we can imagine Thomas also helping out in the pub whilst on leave, gaining his first taste of pub life. Thomas left the army in 1901. He moved to live with Annie and their daughter in Densole, because William Ward was now the licensee of another pub, the Black Horse. On the 1901 census, Thomas describes himself as working as an engine fitter, a skill he would have gained whilst in the Royal Artillery. But clearly he is also working in the pub and beginning to plan a career in pub management for himself and Annie. In December 1904, Thomas took over the licence for the Bricklayers Arms in Shepherdswell, and he moves to Shepherdswell with Annie. The couple were also joined by Annie's father, who had lost the licence of the Black Horse. There seems to have been some dispute with the brewery, and William, that's Annie's father, sees the application for another licence for a pub in Tower Hamlets turned down. So in 1904, December 1904, Thomas begins his life as a pub landlord. Thomas, with his background in the mining industry, was an ideal landlord for the Bricklayers' Arms. Shepherdswell, in the years before the Great War, was one of the centres for the developing Kent coalfield. Snowdown saw shafts sunk beginning in 1907, and it opened as a commercial pit in 1912. Tilmanston, the shafts began to be sunk in 1906 and coal seams were reached in 1912. We also had the Guildford pit near Coldred, where we had shafts beginning to be sunk in 1906 and work continued on that pit in the years before the war. And in 1913 there was an attempt to develop mining at the Stonehall Colliery in Lyddon. Many of the miners, the sinkers who worked at these pits were based in Shepherdswell, lived in Shepherdswell. Shepherdswell was the centre of a transport hub connecting the pits, and the Bricklayers' Arms was one of the social spaces for miners to come together, and it helped these miners establish a sense of identity and community. Even though they arrived in Kent from locations from all over Britain, miners were united by the harshness and dangers of the work. The local newspapers during these years contained regular reports of accidents in the mines. In 1910, Shepherdswell was the stage for a very big funeral for a young lad aged 20 from the Koza family. Helping also to forge miners' identity was the hostility and prejudices of some sections of the local population. So the Bricklayers' Arms was a pub in which miners could meet, could discuss their work, could discuss their lives and also their aspirations. And we can imagine Thomas Williams, the pub landlord, being at the centre of these conversations. Thomas Williams also became a prominent personality in the wider Shepherdswell community. We find a number of references to him in the local press. 2 articles from succeeding weeks in August 1911, for example. In the first, he is on the jury and also a witness at the inquest into the death of an unfortunate farm labourer living almost next door to the pub at number 2 Whittington Terrace. The farm labourer died of heat exhaustion. And the second is a report of a dramatic fire in the rear of the Bricklayers' Arms, which destroyed the garage and also, according to the press, a very valuable car. Thomas was 47 when war broke out. He was therefore above the age at which a reservist could be called up. Yet on the 6th of April 1915, he signed up into the Army Service Corps Mechanical Transport Company. He may have seen advertisements like the ones on the slide. More likely, he would have been contacted by the Royal Garrison Artillery in Dover, where he had served, because there were Army Service Corps attached to each Royal Garrison Artillery Brigade. They acted as drivers, but they also serviced the vehicles and the weapons. And Thomas Williams was a trained engineer and would have had useful skills for the army. Thomas served 2.5 years in northern France, firstly as a private, but later an acting sergeant. He was discharged on the 17th of November 1917, a few weeks after his 50th birthday. A paragraph of the King's regulations on his discharge papers designate him as, quote, no longer physically fit for war service. The papers also describe him as being ill. He is awarded the Silver War Badge for honourable discharge. After the war, Thomas went back to the Bricklayers' Arms. This picture was taken in the early 1920s, although it is rather strange, as Keith Roberts has pointed out, because the background seems to be Whittington Terrace, not the pub The Bricklayers. Thomas also became what Dover Express called a valued supporter of the cricket club. Perhaps he is in this photo taken in 1925 at the Shepherdswell Cricket Club supper. He also sold tomatoes, advertising them regularly in the Dover Express. But in November 1926, his career as a pub landlord came to an end when Mark Moore took over as the landlord of the Bricklayers Arms. After leaving the Bricklayers Arms, Thomas moved to Penland Lodge, Westcourt Lane. He remained an active member of the village community, including the cricket club, though there is some evidence that his health was beginning to fade. But the story of the involvement of the Williams family with the pubs of Shepherdswell does not end there, because in February 1929 his eldest son, also called Thomas, took over the licence for the Bell, and that was a position he held for about a year. In 1938 or 1939, certainly on the eve of the war, Thomas and Annie left the village to live with their oldest son Thomas in Redhill, Surrey. And Thomas Williams died on the 2nd of January 1941 after a very long illness in this house in Redhill. It is interesting and surely an indication of the attachment that the Williams family had to Shepherdswell that the house had been named St. Sibert's. Thomas Williams's life is an illustration of the kaleidoscope of people from varied and different backgrounds who arrived in Shepherdswell in the early years of the 20th century and who helped to shape the character of the village's community. If you would like to contact the History Society, if you have any information about our research on Thomas Williams, please do so by visiting our website. Thank you very much for listening.